Face your shadow before it runs your life. Carl Jung observed that we spend our best years polishing a self we can present to the world, and our worst years discovering what that polishing left in the dark. Jung wrote in his essay on the self, in Collected Works 9, Part 1, Paragraph 45, that the meeting with oneself is, at first, the meeting with one's own shadow, and he meant it exactly as it sounds, not a meeting with your talents, not a meeting with your potential, but a meeting with the very thing you have spent a lifetime stepping around, the cousin you never call, the anger you never raise, the greed you dress up as thrift. And here is the ache of it: you cannot get to the gold of yourself without first walking through the room you have kept locked. And most people never even try the handle. They simply keep decorating the hallway outside it and calling that a life. If this kind of teaching helps you see yourself more clearly, consider staying close by subscribing, so that tomorrow's reflection finds you the same way this one did. The first key is this: the brighter your self-image, the thicker your shadow. This sounds like a paradox, but it is closer to arithmetic. Imagine a woman who prides herself, quietly and constantly, on being the reasonable one in every room, the one who never raises her voice, the one others call unshakable. She has built this reputation over 20 years, one calm response at a time, and she has come to believe, without ever quite saying it aloud, that this is simply who she is. Now ask what happens to her unreason, her raised voice, her shakes. They do not evaporate simply because she has decided they are beneath her. They do not get smaller because she has stopped inviting them to dinner. They collect somewhere, unlit, growing denser with every year she refuses them house room. Picture her on an ordinary Wednesday. A colleague makes an offhand remark in a meeting, nothing especially cruel, and she feels something hot rise in her chest that she has no vocabulary for, because her vocabulary was retired decades ago. So she smiles instead. She always smiles instead, and drives home in a silence that her family has learned not to ask about. This is not composure. This is a debt-accruing interest. Jung's phrase for this was blunt. He said the less the shadow is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Notice he did not say the shadow disappears. He said it darkens, like a photograph left undeveloped in a drawer, still forming, just out of sight, waiting for enough pressure to finally print itself somewhere you did not choose. So the very picture you have built of yourself as good, as calm, as easy to get along with, is not proof that the opposite does not exist in you. It is only proof of where you have put it, and the shine on that picture is paid for, quietly, every single day, by whatever sits in the room you have never opened. So let this be the quiet resolve of the first key. I stop mistaking my polish for my whole self. I stop mistaking my polish for my whole self. The second key is this: the shadow is not a mood. It is an autobiography you have refused to read. We tend to talk about the shadow as if it were a weather system that passes through us. An irritable Tuesday, a jealous flash, something that blows in and blows out again, leaving no residue. But Jung meant something sturdier than mood. He meant a whole chapter of your own story that you closed early and have been pretending was never written. A mood passes. A chapter does not. It waits. Imagine a man, and this is the kind of composite Jung himself would have recognized from a dozen consulting rooms, who has never once in 40 years raised his voice in anger. His colleagues admire him for it. His wife calls him the steadiest man she knows. His children have grown up believing calm is simply the family temperature, and yet those closest to him notice something odd if they look carefully enough. A kind of chill that comes over him when he is crossed, a silence that goes on a beat too long, a way of leaving a room rather than finishing a sentence, a habit of agreeing out loud while something in his face has already disagreed. He has not eliminated his anger. He has simply refused to write its chapter, and so it writes itself, in silences, in migraines that arrive exactly when he is asked to compromise, in a coldness his children will spend their own adulthoods trying to understand, in the small, unexplained distance his wife feels from him on the very evenings he seems most agreeable, This is what Jung meant when he said the darkness must be made conscious rather than merely avoided. He wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious, and the steady man in our example imagines himself made of light entirely. He has built an entire identity on the chapter he refuses to read, and so the anger does not vanish. It migrates. It takes up residence in his body instead of his voice, in his sleep instead of his sentences, in his children's confusion instead of his own conversation. Think of your own week for a moment. Plainly, was there a Sunday evening dread with no clear cause? A fatigue that only ever shows up around one particular person? A silence you kept mistaking for peace when it was closer to a door quietly shutting? A life is an account book, and what is not entered under one heading is entered under another. The anger did not vanish when he refused to feel it. It simply changed its handwriting. And this is true of more than anger. The same is true of grief no one was permitted to show, of longing dressed up as ambition, of envy dressed up as generosity. The ledger always balances, even when the entry is disguised. So ask yourself this week, plainly, where in your own life has a feeling you refuse to name been quietly signing your name to other things? A coldness, a fatigue, a silence that outlasts its cause. An old chapter still being written whether you read it or not. So let this be the resolve of the second key. I read the chapter I have been skipping. I read the chapter I have been skipping. The third key is this. The shadow speaks first through the body and the slip, long before it ever announces itself in a full confession, long before you sit yourself down and say plainly, I am angrier than I pretend, or more afraid than I let anyone see. The shadow does not wait for that kind of honesty. It leaks. It leaks through the sentence that comes out wrong, the name you call your new partner by mistake, the sudden and inexplicable exhaustion that arrives exactly when a certain relative telephones, the headache that shows up only on Sunday nights before the work week you claim to love. Imagine a woman who tells everyone, and half believes it herself, that she has made complete peace with her sister. No old rivalry left, nothing but warmth between them now. And yet every single year, without fail, she forgets her sister's birthday. Not out of malice, she would be horrified at the suggestion. Simply forgets. A clean and total forgetting. And every year she is baffled by her own forgetting. And every year, the sister feels the sting of it a little more. This is not carelessness. Jung would say, this is the shadow filing its report through the only channel it was permitted. The sister's birthday sits in the very room the woman has locked, so the memory cannot get through the front door. And it does not need to. It simply does not arrive at all. And that absence speaks louder than any argument could. Jung spent years gathering exactly this kind of evidence in his early work at the Bergholzli Clinic, in what became known as the association method. He would read a person an ordinary list of words, table, mother, money, quarrel, and time, each response with a stopwatch. And again, a plain word would produce a stumble, a long delay, an answer that did not fit the question at all. Not because the person was lying, but because something in them that was not fully them had reached up and taken the reins for half a second. This is the shadow's native accent. It does not usually announce itself with a speech. It announces itself with a stumble, a stutter, a wrong name, a lost invoice. So this week, notice your own stumbles. Notice the word you cannot quite finish saying to your mother. Notice the client you keep forgetting to invoice. The one who happens to remind you of your father. Notice which room in your own house you avoid tidying, because tidying it would mean admitting something about who used to occupy it. Notice, too, the joke that lands wrong, the compliment that comes out sounding like an insult, the apology you rehearse for hours and somehow never send. None of this is proof that you are careless or unlucky, or simply forgetful by nature. It is proof that something in you has not yet been given a legitimate door to walk through, and so it is using the service entrance instead. Your forgetting, your fatigue, your slips of the tongue. And here is the strange comfort hidden inside this teaching. Once you learn to recognize the accent, you can hear it coming before it fully arrives. A slip is not a moral failure to be apologized away. It is a message finally reaching you, through the only door you happen to leave cracked. So let this be the resolve of the third key. I listen to my slips instead of apologizing them away. I listen to my slips instead of apologizing them away. The fourth key is this. The shadow is not only your own, it is also inherited. And this is the part of the teaching that tends to quiet a room, because it moves the conversation from your private failings to the larger architecture of a family. Jung recalled in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, a dream from his own boyhood, a dream of a storm lantern carried through the dark, and what struck him, looking back on it decades later, as an old man writing his memoir, was not the lantern itself, but what the lantern's light did. It did not banish the darkness around him. It created a small, clear circle and pushed the rest of the darkness back into a wall behind him. The light made the shadow. The light did not defeat it, and Jung came to see this as a picture of something larger than a single dream. The more brightly a family insists on its own goodness, its own respectability, its own having it together, the denser and more absolute the darkness becomes at its edges. And children are uncannily sensitive instruments for exactly this kind of pressure. A child raised by a parent who has never once permitted themselves to be seen as weak, or afraid, or ordinary, does not escape that parent's shadow. The child inherits it, often as a vague and formless anxiety they cannot name, a sense that something is wrong in the house that no one will discuss. Imagine a household where the mother prides herself on total selflessness. She has not had an unkind thought in 30 years, or so she says, and so believes, and her daughter grows up carrying, without ever being told to, a strange, unexplained guilt whenever she wants something for herself. That guilt is not the daughter's own creation. It is the mother's unlived selfishness, handed across the table along with dinner, night after night, without either of them naming it. Now widen the picture, because this inheritance rarely arrives through only one door. Imagine a father who has built his whole identity on being the calm one, the provider, the man who never complains, and imagine that underneath this calm sits an ambition he abandoned decades ago, a life he never let himself want out loud. He does not speak of it. He may not even remember it as a loss, and yet his son grows up restless in a way that has no obvious cause, driven toward achievements that never quite satisfy him, chasing a hunger that was never fully his own to begin with. He is not living his own unlived life, he is finishing his father's, and neither of them would ever call it that. This is what Jung meant when he wrote that the child is educated less by what the parents say than by the unlived life of the parents. The household does not need to be cruel for this to happen. It can be perfectly kind, perfectly loving, and still leak an unspoken burden into the next generation, through a tone that tightens whenever a certain subject arises, through the one topic that is simply never discussed at dinner, through the sigh a parent lets out when they think no one is listening. Children do not need words to receive this kind of inheritance. They read it the way they read weather, and they carry it forward, the way you might carry a coat that was never quite your size. So this week look plainly at your own household, past or present, and ask where the unspoken burden might be sitting. Not to assign blame. Blame changes nothing here, but simply to see it. Because a shadow that is finally seen can at least be set down consciously, rather than passed on again by accident. This is a hard truth, and Jung did not soften it. The unlived life of the parent becomes the unlived question of the child, and it will keep passing down the table, generation after generation, until someone finally turns and looks at what is actually sitting there. So let this be the resolve of the fourth key. I notice what my own light may be pushing into the dark around those I love. I notice what my own light may be pushing into the dark around those I love. The fifth key is this, and here the lens has to turn, because everything so far has been the never angry man, the selfless mother, the composite figures at a comfortable distance from you. But the shadow is not a subject for other people's biographies. It is a subject for yours. So ask yourself plainly, this week, Who irritated you out of all proportion to what they actually did? Not the person who was truly, objectively unreasonable. That is a different matter entirely. But the person whose small offense left you fuming for the rest of the afternoon, replaying the exchange in the shower, composing the retort you never got to say. That disproportion is data. Jung taught that the parts of us we refuse to acknowledge do not simply sit still and wait. They attach themselves to whoever in our daily life happens to carry a resemblance. And the size of your reaction is nearly always a better measurement than the size of the provocation. If a stranger cuts you off in traffic and you are irritated for 30 seconds, that is traffic. That is the ordinary friction of being alive among other people. But if a single comment from a colleague keeps you awake at midnight, turning it over, defending yourself in an argument that already ended 8 hours earlier, something else is happening. Some unlit room in you has had its door rattled. Imagine a dinner table, 6 old friends, and one of them spends the evening steering every conversation back toward his own recent success, his promotion, his renovated kitchen, his clever remark that made the whole office laugh, and everyone else at the table finds him faintly tiresome for an hour and forgets him by morning. Everyone except one guest, who goes home seething, who cannot sleep, who composes in her head, at 2 in the morning, a whole speech about humility she will never deliver, and if you asked her the next day, she would tell you plainly that she cannot stand people who need that much attention. But notice what her fury actually measures. It does not measure how loud he was. The others heard the same voice at the same table. It measures how loudly she has forbidden herself, for years, to want any attention at all. Somewhere back in her own history she learned that wanting to be noticed was shameful, greedy, unbecoming, and she buried that wanting so completely that she no longer recognizes it as her own. So when she meets it walking around freely in someone else, unashamed, at a dinner table, it does not simply annoy her, it accuses her, and the accusation is the disproportion. This is the pattern behind nearly every fury that outlasts its cause. We do not usually rage for an evening over a stranger's ordinary flaw. We rage over the flaw that is also, secretly, an old familiar resident of our own unlit room. And this works the same way at the office as it does at that dinner table. Ask yourself honestly which co-worker's habits genuinely cost you sleep. Is it the one who is careless with deadlines, or is it the one who takes a long lunch without apologizing for it? And if it is the second, sit with why an unapologetic lunch should matter to you at all. Somewhere in you is a person who has never once taken lunch without first mentally justifying it. And that person is furious, quietly, at the freedom the other one enjoys without asking permission. This is not a flaw in you to be ashamed of discovering. It is simply the shadow doing exactly what Jung said it does, refusing to stay in its room and instead finding a face in your daily life to wear. The method here is not complicated, but it is not comfortable either. The exercise Jung's approach points toward is sometimes called the not like me list, and it asks you to sit down honestly and write 5 qualities you would deny with real heat if a friend suggested them belong to you. Laziness, vanity, envy, cowardice, cruelty, whatever the list turns out to be for you specifically, and then to notice which name on that list, when you say it aloud, makes your chest tighten just slightly. That tightening is the door, not proof that you are secretly a monster, only proof that something in you has been standing guard at that word for a very long time. Jung's counsel here was never to condemn yourself for finding this in you. Self-condemnation is simply the shadow wearing a nobler mask. Punishing yourself for having a shadow is still a way of refusing to actually look at it. His counsel was to get curious instead. Calmly, almost like a naturalist studying an animal track. What quality in that person am I refusing to admit might also live quietly in me? Are they boastful? And have I spent years training myself never to claim credit for anything I have earned? Are they careless? And have I built my entire identity on never once letting anyone down? The heat of your own denial is the clue. We rarely work up real anger, defending against a trait that has no root in us whatsoever, a trait we are simply neutral toward. We work up real anger, only defending against the trait that is closest to true. This is the turn the whole teaching has been walking toward. The shadow was never really about the never-angry man or the selfless mother. It was about you, sitting right now, remembering exactly who made you unreasonably furious this month, and asking, honestly, what part of yourself that fury has been guarding all along. So let this be the resolve of the fifth key. I study my own disproportion before I study anyone else's fault. I study my own disproportion before I study anyone else's fault. The sixth key is this, and it is the one that keeps people from ever beginning the work at all. Facing the shadow is not the same as becoming it. This fear runs quietly under nearly every avoidance we practice. The fear that if we look too closely at the anger, the envy, the laziness, the greed we have spent a lifetime disowning, we will be swallowed by it. We will turn into the very thing we feared, and so it feels safer, endlessly safer, to keep the door locked and simply manage the symptoms, the coldness, the migraine, the disproportionate fury, rather than open the room and see what is actually inside it. But there is a second danger hiding just behind the first one, and it deserves just as much attention, because once a person finally hears this kind of teaching, once they finally admit there is a shadow, a strange overcorrection can happen. Imagine a man who spends a weekend reading about the shadow for the first time in his life, and by Monday he has decided that honesty now means saying every unkind thought aloud, that authenticity now means letting his temper finally have its say after decades of silence. He tells himself he is doing the brave thing, the shadow work, but what he is actually doing is trading one kind of unconsciousness for another. He has not made the anger conscious, he has simply handed it the wheel under a new and more flattering name. This is not facing the shadow, this is being possessed by it with a philosophy attached. And Jung was precise about the difference. He wrote, in Ion, that recognizing the shadow requires considerable moral effort. And notice the word he chose, effort, not surrender, not indulgence, effort. The work is neither to keep the door bolted forever, nor to fling it open and move your whole household into that dark room. The work is to walk in, look around carefully, and come back out still standing, still yourself, only now with a fuller inventory of what you actually are. Think of it this way. Imagine a woman who has spent years quietly congratulating herself on never being envious, and then one ordinary afternoon, a friend's success lands on her with a force she cannot explain. A small, ugly satisfaction when the friend's plan falls through. A flicker of relief she is ashamed even to notice. If she is unconscious of her shadow, she will simply deny the flicker and change the subject in her own mind. And if she overcorrects the other way, she will decide that honesty now requires telling the friend exactly how she feels, delivering the envy like a confession that serves no one but her own need to feel raw and real. But there is a third way, quieter than both. She can sit with the flicker privately, admit to herself, plainly, that she wanted what her friend had, that she is not above this after all, and let that admission simply inform how carefully she chooses her words the next time they speak. Nothing dramatic happens on the outside. No confession, no outburst. Only a woman who now knows one true thing about herself that she did not know a week earlier. This is what moral effort actually looks like in an ordinary life. It rarely looks like a breakthrough. It looks like a small private honesty that changes nothing visible and everything real. Jung's own image for this balance was the storm lantern again. The light does not need to blaze so brightly that it burns down the house it is meant to illuminate. It only needs to be steady enough to see by. The goal was never to become your shadow, loud, unleashed, finally excused for every impulse under the banner of authenticity. And the goal was never to keep it locked away either, growing denser in the dark while you call yourself well-adjusted. The goal was to know it well enough that it stops running your life through the side door while you remain convinced the front door is the only one that exists. This knowing is never finished in a weekend. It is not a single confrontation after which you emerge cleansed and finished with the matter. It is closer to a long acquaintance you keep renewing. A relative you do not particularly enjoy, but have decided, finally, to stop pretending does not exist. Some weeks the acquaintance will be easy. You will notice the flicker of envy or anger, and simply nod at it and move on wiser. Other weeks it will catch you off guard, and you will overreact, or underreact, and have to sit with that too. This is not failure. This is the ordinary shape of the work. So let this be the resolve of the sixth key. I face what I have refused, without becoming what I feared. I face what I have refused, without becoming what I feared. Here is the whole picture. The brighter the self-image, the thicker the shadow behind it. The shadow is an autobiography written in silences when you refuse to write it in words. It speaks first through the slip and the sudden fatigue. Before it ever speaks in a full sentence, it passes down the table from parent to child. Whenever a house insists too hard on its own goodness, your own disproportionate reactions are the clearest map you will ever be handed. And facing what you find there is effort, not surrender, knowledge, not indulgence. A long acquaintance rather than a single dramatic reckoning. The room stays locked only for as long as you agree not to try the handle, and every year you keep it locked. Whatever is inside keeps writing your story anyway, in the coldness, in the headache, in the fury that outlives its cause. The invitation Jung left behind was never to hate what you find in that room, only to finally turn on the light and see it plainly, for what it is, which is not a monster, only the unlived half of a life still waiting, patiently, in the dark, to be let back into the house. Your shadow was never asking to be destroyed. It was only ever asking to be seen. And that, quietly, is how you stop letting it run the life you thought was entirely your own.